So I finally want to end up with why they didn't go the way of America. What distinguishes them, and how does this help us explain, or at least prioritize, the causes of the American Revolution? Well, what really distinguishes them is not their ideology or their political structure. We've seen that that's very similar. What really distinguished them, and the emphasis that I gave in my book on the British West Indies, was partly their economic relationship with Britain. The British West Indies particularly relied on the British sugar market. Britain then, and to this day, were the biggest per capita sugar consumers anywhere in the world. And you only have to go into a grocery shop in Britain, look at the candy counter to have verification of that. And the fact is that the British West Indies could not produce sugar and its related products of molasses and rum at a competitive price, which is why New Englanders were smuggling their molasses from the French West Indies. It cost a third more for them to produce sugar, and it's partly to do with economies of scale. Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, produced more sugar than all of the British islands combined. They needed, therefore, the mercantilist system. They needed the Trade and Navigation Acts that kept foreign competition out and that guaranteed them the British market. The Irish situation is more complicated because a lot of what Ireland produced, linen and wool, was competing directly with English farmers, and the British were trying to keep it out of their markets. At the same time, most of Ireland's exports were going and would continue to go to Britain. That was their natural economic ally. But another, and maybe even more important characteristic that they had in common is when I talk about attitudes, I'm really talking about the elites of these colonies, the people at the top. And one of their great concerns was that they needed the British Empire and they needed the British Army because of the social composition of those colonies. Only a quarter of the population of Ireland were Protestant. The other 3/4 were Catholic. And in the British West Indies, it was even more extreme. Only 10% of the population was white. The other 9/10 were enslaved. And the elites of these countries literally used the term the enemies within. They feared rebellion at any time, and they were quite right to do so. In the 1760s in Ireland, you had white boy rebellions, as they were known, and the Hearts of Steel movement. In the British West Indies, places like St. Vincent continually had rebellions between 1773 and 1770 and 73. John Paul Jones got his early career there. So did Major Ferguson, who recreated the repeating rifle and died here in South Carolina. He served down in Trinidad. Jamaica had a major rebellion in 1760 and again in 1776. And in fact, at the end of the century, Ireland had its ultimate rebellion, the largest until it gained independence of 1698. It was led initially by Protestants, but became much more radicalized under the influence of the French Revolution. And the British West Indies they had more rebellions, but they didn't have a major successful rebellion, but Haiti did. And that revolution could have happened in the British West Indies. These colonies were also more colonial in character. The ties with Britain were closer. The elites in these colonies were often educated in Britain. And one other similarity between Ireland and the West Indies is that the very elite were absentee. They actually lived in England, which was untrue of anywhere in America except Charleston, South Carolina, where about 30 families did have a member of the family constantly living in England. George Washington, when he visited Barbados, also pointed to another very major difference that might help explain why they remain loyal. He said there are no yeomen here. What today we might call middle class or middling class. It's not historical to do that because the social system was more hierarchical, but there was a lack of middling people, not only in the British West Indies, but also in Ireland. And finally, although I would emphasize this the least, but there are religious differences. The elite in both Ireland and the British West Indies were Anglican Church of England, who were taught to obey authority, not to resist. Now, I wouldn't make much of that because we should remember Jefferson, George Washington, many, especially the elite in the South, were also Anglicans. But what was lacking was the real tradition of dissent in the upper leadership. The West Indian colonies had Quakers, they'd had Presbyterians, but they weren't organized. They had no organized religions other than the Moravians down in the British West Indies, not until after the American Revolution when these other religions would flourish. And in Ireland, the dissenters, as they would have been called at the time, the Ulster Presbyterians, were indeed the ones who showed most support for the American Revolution. But once America allied with France, a Catholic country, that became much more muted.